Donald Trump seemed to not accept the fact that there would be free and fair elections. That I found very interesting in a democratic country such as the United States. A former president is saying and is not attesting and endorsing the fact that there will be free and fair elections. I think it's interesting to note that the U.S. presidential debate is not constitutionally mandated. It's a customary event that has come across over the years, and many U.S. presidents have the likes of John F. Kennedy, Ronald Reagan, Jimmy Carter have all been involved in debates of this nature. I think the interesting part about this particular debate was the fact that there was so much factual information that was thrown out by both the parties, which almost immediately could be challenged. To the extent that, so I think I'll focus on the legal issues, and because there's a lot of economic and trade related points that are being discussed. On January 6th, the Capitol Hill event that took place, Joe Biden made a claim that this was completely Donald Trump's responsibility, and that's where the media was taking it, and Donald Trump is involved in various trials and criminal cases that are to that effect. Donald Trump's sort of rebuttal and excuse to that was that this was not under his mandate. It was in fact under Nancy Pelosi's mandate, who was supposed to give the approval for X amount of troops coming into Washington, D.C. and taking charge of that. So I think basic fundamentals of presidential authority and a more state level authority were kind of being thrown around. And it just showed the lack of clarity that, let's say, the candidates had about their own positions and their own kind of rules of authority as well. So I found that quite interesting that that as a president, neither candidates were able to take a forceful position on whose responsibility the January events of Capitol Hill vested with. So I thought that was one fairly interesting point that came out of the debate. There was also the matter of abortions that was discussed. And I think there's been a history in the United States of banning abortions, and there are various constitutional rights that come into that. What I found interesting was the fact that Donald Trump said that he appointed Republican judges in the Supreme Court, and that created a narrative and a Supreme Court which decided that abortion should not be killed, and abortion meaning the killing of children. And I think the case and the history of that particular case, which is Roe versus Wade, is quite distinct because it's about throwing out such important national issues in such an insensitive fashion was also not taken well. You see, we have to understand that the presidential debate is targeted towards undecided voters, right? And once the political parties nominate their candidates, it takes place to basically catch the attention. So I think rather than getting into some real issues that the United States economy is dealing with, it becomes a matter of rhetoric. And as far as rhetoric is concerned, Donald Trump perhaps on balance did do a better job. It seemed the coherence on Joe Biden's side was just was not there. He seemed to be justifying the budget and the funding to Ukraine to support America's borders and to be in line with actions against terrorism. But of course, there was an undertone with regard to the Israel-Palestine conflict, which nobody seemed to touch upon. They went into economic issues such as unemployment and inflation. But again, the facts and figures that were thrown out by both candidates were starkly incorrect. As far as diplomacy was concerned, trade relations with China was also, I think, a key feature. And it just seemed like there was a political point scoring match. And it was almost as if one world leader was not happy with Donald Trump, one world leader was not happy with Joe Biden. And, due to Donald Trump's criminal trials that are proceeding at the moment, which interestingly enough does not preclude him from running for office, it got a little bit personal in the sense that Joe Biden said that the only convicted felon was Donald Trump. Donald Trump hit back by saying that it was actually Joe Biden's son who was a convicted felon. And quite a lot of name calling was thrown around. I think the pharmaceutical side there were COVID side. There was again a blame game that took place for the response to COVID. Now, not Donald Trump, although has been known for making sort of exaggerated remarks, maybe dealt with COVID in a manner which involved enhanced government spending and led to some kind of inflationary measures. On the other hand, Joe Biden, upon assuming office, says that he assumed office with a 15% inflation rate, which was not true, which was only 6.5%. As far as immigration is concerned, while Donald Trump, tries to promote tightening borders and tries to be the champion of homeland security, the borders have been the immigration policy has definitely become more difficult, and it seems to be tighter during Joe Biden's time. So I think to conclude, maybe on the tax side, Donald Trump seems to be in favor of tax cuts. Joe Biden seems to be enhancing taxes on all classes, especially large business owners and industry and manufacturers. The choice really boils down, and I think America has to decide on, and unfortunately has to decide on rhetoric. And we can draw a comparison to Pakistan and our party manifestos that come out during general elections, and from time to time. Of course, there's no prime ministerial debate as such that takes place. But really, I think we can draw an analogy in which political leaders come out and work on the rhetoric to captivate the masses. I think from what I've read so far, the Biden supporters were his consistency to remain in office. And I think that's made the unsure Biden supporters maybe travel towards Donald Trump, because it just seems that maybe he's not going to be able to hold himself for a period of 4 years. Now, having said that, there is, of course, there is the wrath of Donald Trump that has to be thought about on balance. I mean, the aggressive policies, it's, of course, a very open economy, a very forward-moving and forward-thinking economy in which there are proper constitutional rights. And for example, transgenders or their rights for their representation. Donald Trump has almost immediately kind of shot this down, and he said that he's going to make this all illegal. And he's going to prosecute not only those that elect for changes in their gender, but even the doctors that are behind this. So that's a large constituency you're kind of messing around with. It's difficult to tell right now at this juncture. You've got criminal cases of all sorts, which were mentioned in a very graphic manner in the presidential debate. So they come to the forefront, and there's no guarantee that Donald Trump will be acquitted of all charges on appeal. He still has to go through that process. But then again, you have a faint Joe Biden who seems to be relying on the fact that Donald Trump is a sort of overgrown bully making tall claims. If you were to ask me who is going to win, I think it's definitely the tide. The Joe Biden camp would be tipping in favor of Donald Trump simply because his rhetoric was just not good enough. Trump said China and others stopped buying from Iran under his pressure, right? This never stopped, so that's also a little bit of a tall claim. Iran and terror groups. Trump said that Iran didn't fund Hamas or Hezbollah or other terror groups under his administration, ignoring evidence to the contrary. In terms of in terms of the actual crisis that took place, yes, it was largely left unaddressed, and in those circumstances, I think neither party was able to factually address the Middle East crisis or even talk about openly how they have individually and respectfully dealt with the Middle Eastern crisis. So in such circumstances, I'm not quite sure that perhaps it was intentional. And of course, the Middle Eastern crisis is a sensitive topic, not only for the United States, but for the entire world at large. So they probably intentionally were briefed not to bring it up in some whatever form or fashion. But I think it's a matter of just they stayed very consciously away from these topics. I think it's a little more complicated than that, right? There's an arrest warrant out for Vladimir Putin at the moment from the ICC, the International Criminal Court. Of course, there are enforceability issues related to those kind of orders and warrants of such nature. But having said that, it's something that is quite deep into the dark right now. I mean, it doesn't. You have Donald Trump saying that Joe Biden pays $6 billion per hostage to get them released USD, whereas Donald Trump would not negotiate on that level of bounty to get a hostage out. So I think it doesn't. Humanitarian crisis doesn't go away overnight. It just depends. I mean, yes, Congress seems to be funding these wars that are taking place, and they overwhelmingly seem to be funding these wars. There have been laws passed to fund the Ukraine war and the Palestinian-Israel conflict that is taking place. And yes, when once the general election takes place, it'll be interesting. Actually, the powerhouse becomes Congress, because if there is yes, there is the ability to pass executive orders, but an executive order cannot always make laws like Congress can in order to fund projects, i.e., in the form of war. So the United States then it hinges on the presidential election, who forms majority in Congress, and who really forms majority on the Supreme Court. In terms of the Democrats and Republicans, so that becomes a very important aspect as far as these wars are concerned. It's interesting, right? Like, for an undecided voter, you would perhaps deem an undecided voter as and not to make a general comment over here, but as a less sophisticated voter, and I would say that because they would be thinking of their basic personal needs. So let's take the drug spending cap, for example. Donald Trump mentioned that there was an overall $200 spending cap on all drugs. Joe Biden mentioned there was a $200 cap on overall spending on drugs since he's been in office, but that's not the ground reality. The ground reality is that there has been a $2,000, so it's a 10x of a factum that he kind of just didn't account for. So I think by making an incorrect statement of that nature, especially to an audience that is undecided, it would be putting him in a bit of a difficult situation, because they would know the ground reality, because they go and buy these drugs when they are in the healthcare insurance system. I think as far as the unemployment rate is concerned, unemployment has not been 15% when Joe Biden took office. It was around 6.4%. So to say that the unemployment has soared to a level of that amount, again, the undecided voter would know those figures. There's a sentimental aspect of this, right? That Joe Biden said that he's the only person in the world only president in recent history that didn't have any troops dying anywhere in the world. That's not true. I mean, at the end of the day, there are U.S. soldiers. In fact, there is an entire jurisdiction called the Anti-Terrorism Act, in which deceased soldiers' families can file against financial institutions and seek civil claims against these deaths that have taken place on accords of war on terror, etc. So, I think the undecided voter looks at basic at more basic problems rather than getting into the larger economy and the more macro issues. So I think Joe Biden definitely, by throwing out incorrect figures on his watch as president, vis-a-vis having a constitutional position, and is definitely going to suffer more from that incorrect information than Donald Trump is, because Donald Trump isn't in office right now. And one would argue that when he comes to office, this will happen. When he assumes charge, this will happen. So I think that's definitely a point in which you can say a +1 for Donald Trump and a -1 for Joe Biden.